So we're going to go to the next and the last panel, Geopolitics and Defence, Walking a Fine Line. I welcome our panellists out, and I'll introduce them in just one moment. Wherever works. All right, the last session of the day, but chatting to people in the breaks, I know it's one that's been very much anticipated. First, I'll just introduce the panel. We have here Dr. Ruben Steff. Now, for those of you that are observant, you'll notice, having read the programs closely over the last 2 days, that Dr. Ruben Steff is not Dr. Anna Powles. I spoke to Anna on Tuesday. She was doing some project work in Suva. And I said, let me know if there's any flight trouble. She said, there's never any flight trouble out of Suva. There was flight trouble out of Suva. And so Ruben has stepped into the breach, thank you. Ruben is a researcher here at the University of Waikato and researches into the topic of geopolitics. And given this topic, remarkably on point, he's just published a book called New Zealand's Geopolitics and the US-China Competition. So as it happens, and in a demonstration of the depth of the University of Waikato's research interests, we happen to have an expert across the road. We're also joined by two people that will be familiar to many of us. First, the Honourable Murray McCully. Murray was a Member of Parliament for, I think, 30 years, close on. Minister for 17 of those, including 9 years as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and obviously has deep knowledge across many of these topics. And another familiar face, Honourable Andrew Little, welcome. Andrew was, of course, a Member of Parliament. He was a President and a leader of the Labour Party of New Zealand, Minister of Justice, of Health, of Treaty Negotiations, and particularly relevant to this discussion, Minister responsible for Defence and also our intelligence agencies, which means there are some questions he cannot answer, which applies to Murray as well. So you're welcome to ask, but there may be some things that are off limits. So I'm going to start with you, Ruben, and just for us, we're not a specialist audience in foreign affairs. Well, some might be, but I'm not. But this is a really complex world. We've had a discussion yesterday on US politics, Trump, but then you look to countries that we might have considered more stable in Europe. You've got UK, Germany, France with real instability. You've got Israel and Gaza. You've got Syria. You've got South Korea. You've got Russia and Ukraine. We've got a rising India. We've got then this emerging narrative, and not in the last couple of years only, about China and the US, the world's two largest economies. And close to home, we've got a lot going on in the Pacific right at the moment. Can you give us a snapshot of, I guess, the picture that's going on and where New Zealand sits in this as a pretty small player, and just give us the helicopter view of that before we get into some of the more detail.
Sure, thanks for the introduction, and kia ora, good midday everyone. So at the macro level, I think we're seeing an intensification of the US-China great power competition. It stretches across military, economic, diplomatic, informational lines. This is taking place against an increasingly multipolar system. Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, the other day came out and said we are now in a multipolar system, no longer a kind of pseudo-unipolar one. I think you could also say we are seeing two security orders essentially collide. You have the United States alliance system, currently troubled, but nonetheless, it was deepened under the Biden administration. This kind of encircles Eurasia. If you know your geopolitical theory, well, Eurasia is considered the heartland of the world, and what do we see play out over and over again in recent centuries is a kind of an alignment or entanglement of Eurasian autocratic powers who then confront kind of the maritime powers. Okay, that seems to be happening again. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, parts of the Middle East, parts of Southeast Asia, up against essentially a US-led alliance system encircling Eurasia. I'll get to us soon. I'll get to the South Pacific soon. I think it's important to recognise too that we have placed our faith in this thing called the liberal international order or rules-based order, which is clearly under severe stress. in New Zealand, I think we've tended to think that this order just kind of exists in the abstract. It's based upon values and norms, and to some degree it is, but it's also underpinned by power, by states willing to defend that order and uphold that order. What we see throughout history is that the international order tends to be constructed by countries that win the most recent war or global confrontation. Over time, the balance of power shifts between the status quo powers that have created that order and other states that rise who feel left out of the order and challenge it. So while values and norms matter, what also really matters is the status quo powers, essentially the United States, its allies and partners, being willing to defend that order. Because you can be as pure as you want, but if you lose the battle, your values won't matter, right? There'll be a footnote in history. We've seen that time and time again. For New Zealand, I think we need to return to a first principles approach. You know, what is our location in the world? What are our material characteristics? What are the imperatives that flow from this? Because ideology and well-meaning idealism is nice, helps you sleep at night, but it can also delude you and set you off on the wrong path. Coming out of the South Pacific, it'd be nice to have a map here to get into the geopolitics and the geostrategic developments here, but this is the Pacific. Here's China, East Asia. They're what called the three island chains. The first island chain goes from Japan around Taiwan, down by the South China Sea. You have a second island chain going from Japan outwards down to Indonesia. A third island chain that goes from Hawaii down to the South Pacific and New Zealand. Now, we're not making this up, okay? American strategists and military officials talk about that, as do Chinese officials. And the Americans are trying to sew up, deepen this alliance system through these island chains, and the Chinese are challenging it, trying to break it up or find positions within the first island chain and beyond it to get military positions in case there's war, conflict, or to have veto power over commercial sea lanes and so on. Over here you have the Americans, right? They have sea lines of communications and trade and travel routes from the west coast of the US through to Guam, Hawaii, Japan, South Korea, Australia. What's down here? Us, the South Pacific. Okay? We tend to think, hey, this is a benign environment, we can just sit pretty down here, no one cares about us. Not the case anymore. We are now a strategic theatre because we're part of the third island chain. The Americans and the other democratic allies want to make sure that we are secure, that there aren't Chinese naval bases or nodes turning up down here. So if there's conflict or whatever in the future, Chinese submarines aren't popping up and flanking their positions. Okay? So New Zealand is becoming increasingly geostrategically significant. Okay? South, we're down here. We're the flank of Australia. Antarctica in the future is going to be more and more relevant. Different countries are looking for positions down there. And so on. Okay, look, I'll cut most of that short there. I've already said a lot. One final thing, I think we'll get into this, is what to do with the Defence Force, right? 1% of spending of GDP on the Defence Force. People are worried about Trump putting the pressure on us. He probably should, but even separate to that, we should want a credible Defence Force for a whole range of reasons. Not just because of what I'm talking about now, because we're going to have to respond to disasters in the South Pacific. Climate-induced disasters within New Zealand. We need a Defence Force. We need an organisation that can run complex operations, and we just don't really have that right now. And I think we'll also get into AUKUS Pillar 2, which, quite frankly, we probably have to join if we want to sustain a modern defence force that can be interoperable with partners overseas, and if there is, in worst-case scenario, a conflict, we're not wiped out within minutes. Okay? So I'll leave it there.
All right. Well, I think we've broken the back of that. Thank you, Ruben. Can I pass to you, Andrew? And I'm going to pick up where Ruben left off on defence. Obviously, you were minister. Now, I believe you kicked off the work on the national security strategy in your time in office, leading to the defence capability plan, which last I saw was due about middle of this year, I think. I don't know if the timeline's still there. The discussion came up yesterday with Tim Grosser and co about what Trump US might require of allies to spend on defence. It has been 1-ish%. What's your take on whether we will be required to? Minister of Finance was here yesterday morning saying there's not a lot of cash in the kitty. Will we be required to spend more money, which is going to be a trade-off with health and education and roads and all the rest? And what do you expect to see from that defence capability plan?
Yeah, I think the challenge will be won't necessarily be about volumes of spend, but it will be about capability. So I think the expectation is that we have close partners we work with. We have not only our own interests to defend in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific, but historically, and I expect going into the future, we'll be expected to contribute where needed in other parts of the world. We've assisted training combatants in the Ukraine war. We've had a long-standing role in the Middle East and the multinational observer force in Sinai and Golan Heights. Who knows what's going to happen there in the short to medium term, but I expect we'll continue to be expected to play a role there. I think the other aspect that's relevant is the capability that defence forces have in the modern world is changing. Technology is changing rapidly. The challenge for military forces around the world is getting people to work in them. We have generations coming through now who do not see a career in defence as combatants or a whole bunch of other things. And we have combat that now can be conducted largely remotely. We've got to kind of get with the program on that. If we want to work with other forces, particularly with the US, their expectations will be that we'll have levels of capability, levels of technology, and ability to be interoperable and to partner with them at an operational sort of level. So that will drive what we need to do. The Defence Capability Plan it has been delayed. I expect, in a sense, I hope it's because there is a fierce debate going on about how much we should be investing in defence. My strong view is, given the current conditions and the fact that we're now, even medium to long term, we should expect the sort of tensions that are at play at the moment to continue, is that we do need to increase our defence spend and embrace the best technology available to enable us to secure our interests.
Yeah, it's pretty... Your point about fierce debate is, I suspect and hope, true, because it's not looking so benign. Murray, what's your take, I guess, stitching together the themes of your colleagues on either side? What's your take on, how would you be looking at this if you were still in office there, around the interplay between particularly the foreign affairs and alliances and the defence side?
Well, Matt, can I just start with an addendum to your generous introduction? I retired from politics over 7 years ago. I'm almost completely rehabilitated, and having lived a life of obscurity and irrelevance in Northland for most of that time, haven't kept up to date with any of the reporting on some of these things. So it's a sort of possibly an outdated view. But look, the big issue when I first got into the foreign affairs role was about whether we were going to have an independent foreign policy. And I think that we need to realise that decision's really been made for us. We really are on our own in the world and have to make our own decisions. We've got people who we trade with but can't form security alliances with. We've got people who we can form good diplomatic relationships with that don't want to buy our stuff. It's a complex world. We just have to get on with it and deal with what we've got. And I think that in the world we're seeing shape up today, that's even more important than it was in my time. The US elections have thrown up some turbulence for the short term, and we've got to wait and just see how that all settles. But the fact of the matter is that we've got an advantage from our geography in that there are big markets close by, particularly China. But I guess the thing that I would have recommended to any government since my retirement would be focusing on Southeast Asia as a really key area for both diplomacy and trade activity. Those 10 ASEANs have got substantial populations, but they also share many of our security concerns. I mean, the Vietnamese have been dealing with the Chinese for over 1,000 years, and they're pretty sophisticated at it as well. These are countries, many of them have got competing claims for the South China Seas with China, and I think we should be focusing, and I'm pleased to see current government is focusing hard on nurturing those relationships. And going to Ruben's point about the Pacific, that is in many ways our value proposition to our partners. We have huge Pacific connections in this country. We've got a relatively small budget in every sense. Where we can really add value to our partners is by doing some heavy lifting within our own region, where we're uniquely qualified to do it, and we've got some quite helpful history.
Thank you, and there are a couple of themes there. I'm certainly going to come back to the South China Sea in a moment. Can I stay with you for a moment, Murray, on the Pacific? Some of us will have seen some recent commentary in media about the Cook Islands, some about Kiribati. Many in the room won't be familiar with the detail of that. Can you just, I know you spent an enormous amount of time in the Pacific, but can you just give us a snapshot of what's happening, and then I'll go to others, one that might be important.
Well, the Cook Islands, first a declaration of interest. When I retired, the Cook Islands government awarded me status as an honorary resident.
Wonderful.
So I have a particular affinity for that place and watched the passport debate with some interest. This is not a new discussion. The Cook Islands governments going back over the years have flirted with the idea of having their own passport, and there's been quite a lot of diplomatic pushing and shoving behind the scenes, certainly in my time, and I know throughout last year. There's been a view that you can have your cake and eat it too, that you can have New Zealand citizenship and New Zealand passports at the same time. And of course, the issue of UN membership for the Cook Islands has brought this into focus as well.
And so for those that don't know, Cook's does have UN membership, or is under ours?
Cook Islands does not have UN membership, and because they are part of the realm of New Zealand, they work with us on defence and foreign policy matters, and Mr. Peters has been quick to remind them of that. That discussion's still something that's got to play out. So there's been a couple of flashpoints. We saw one before Christmas where there was, I imagine, quite an embarrassing story for the Cook Islands government about the passport issue. There's now been one coming the other way about the discussions taking place in China. Look, I'll just say this. I know Winston Peters quite well. We've spent a lot of time in the Pacific together, and he shares my own strong, positive views about relationships with the Pacific, and I know his personal relationships there matter to him as well. So for things to flare up in the way they have, obviously there are some troubles sitting there, but I'm quite confident they will get resolved. But these are tensions that have been boiling away for some time. And the Cook Islands, of course, do have this potential resource, manganese nodules as they're called, which they see as the future prosperity for their country.
And so what are those?
Those are basically nodules that sit on the ocean floor that contain magnesium and a whole bunch of other rare metals that actually are going to be worth a lot of money if someone can develop the technology to mine them in a way that's environmentally acceptable. We haven't had much to offer them in that regard. Various other countries have been saying we're here to help on that front. So it's a mix of things that gives the Cook Islands, on one hand, a historical connection to New Zealand, which they value, but they want increasingly to be able to explore other areas for cooperation. And of course, the Chinese have been putting development assistance in there for some time. Indeed, in my time, we put up a tripartite deal to try and get New Zealand, the Cook Islands, and China working together, because I thought joining them was going to be better than beating them in that regard. So there's been this is a saga that's still got some time to play out. On the Kiribati issue, look, Ruben's pointed to the significance of that area. Kiribati has got a massive EEZ, about 3.55 million square kilometres. It's absolutely huge. And they share with other Pacific countries a tuna resource that is, again, massive, worth billions of dollars a year. Unfortunately, they get a relatively small share of the benefit of that. So it's not hard to see what's behind. It's not just strategic location in a raw sense. There were resources there as well. And we saw, after the election of the government recently, allegiances shift from Taiwan to China.
From the Kiribati government.
In Kiribati. And we've seen an increasingly exotic discussion taking place about areas for cooperation, which will, of course, worry the US and others. And this is a real issue. There are real resources and real strategic issues on the table. And I'll perhaps just say one thing more, Matt. This is an area where the US has let itself down over a long period of time. You've seen President Biden announce $800 million of American support for the Pacific. I think they got as far as building a couple of buildings and putting some people in them and maybe buying a couple of utes. But this is a game that's like politics. You know, you've got to deliver stuff. Governments that don't deliver stuff get thrown out. Donors that don't deliver stuff get noticed. And in the region, the US has not been able to deliver stuff. The diplomacy has made it difficult. The fact that in the compact states, you've got the Department of the Interior as the lead players for many things. Those things have been unhelpful. And now you're seeing China deliver stuff in a way that the US hasn't been able to. New Zealand and Australia have done a better job of that. The multilaterals have been hopeless. You know, the think that press releases with big dollars are going to matter. Actually, delivering stuff on the ground is what matters, what gets noticed. And I think increasingly, that's where New Zealand's got to get itself organised, make sure that our special skill is to deliver stuff on the ground, often in difficult places. And if we can do that, we'll continue to bring real value to our partners.
Thank you, Murray. So Ruben, there'll be some in the audience who have visited the Cook Islands, who may be from the Cook Islands or Kiribati, and they'll be saying, these places, they're suddenly a geopolitical player or theatre, in your term earlier. Why does this matter?
Well, clearly it matters to the people living in these countries, but I'll come from it from our perspective. This is the region of existential importance for New Zealand. What happens in Europe, Ukraine, sure, significant. What happens in the Middle East, sure, significant. But for us, the ball game is the South Pacific. It's where we physically reside. I think sometimes we almost forget that. The approaches to New Zealand come through the South Pacific. In World War II, we were on the chopping block. We have forgotten the history of World War II, right? Had the Japanese won the Battle of Midway against the Americans, which they probably should have won, Australia and New Zealand probably would have been invaded, right? The Americans probably still win the war, but it would have taken a lot longer and we would have been seriously threatened. We've forgotten all of that. So history does not go in this purely benign direction that we have imagined it does over the last sort of 25 years or so. So what happens there is of significance to us. We don't know the future. I don't want to be an alarmist. I don't want to be an alarmist for the sake of it. It's to look at the pattern of behaviour. It's to look at the data points. It's to look at the strategy we see playing out and to see these islands suddenly seemingly in play, you might say. And that's why we should be concerned. That's why we should raise the alarm now rather than later, because there could be certain developments in the coming years. We wake up 5-10 years from now and our children say to us, what the hell were you guys thinking? You could see all this happening in front of you. You had the data points, you had the intelligence, you had the evidence. And you know, you're having your flat whites and you're worrying about the fiscal situation and this is all matters. We're all riding
into Sky worrying about the satellite.
Don't get me wrong, the economy matters, but our geostrategic security should be probably a priority, I think.
So can I, and I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, Andrew, but can I then pop back to you, Murray? You mentioned a term a couple of minutes ago, which is about our value proposition. So we've had plenty of discussions about the US and our relationships with other great powers. What do you mean by the Pacific potentially being our value proposition in a broader sense?
Well, against the background that Ruben's described, you've got to ask how many large nations or multinationals, multilaterals are going to get themselves involved in some of these small places which are difficult to access, where the politics is fraught and where there are often other complications as well. And New Zealand, because we have some historical links, but also family links, is able to manoeuvre its way around the Pacific in a way that other larger players can't. I'd argue, with due deference to my friend Scott, who I know was speaking here last night, that New Zealand is able to more quietly work its diplomatic way around the Pacific than our Australian friends. And if you look at the history of New Zealand engagement in places like the Solomon Islands, we've been able to do things that other countries find quite challenging. So I think that if you are looking at the value we can add to our friends in the United States, our European friends who are increasingly focused on this part of the world as well, being able to use our special advantages in our location to make things happen in places where it is really difficult to make things happen. There's a special talent and skill that we provide.
Yes. So I'm going to take that and then across to you, Andrew. Looking at this from a Defence Force point of view, I think somebody's made the point yesterday that people don't expect us to have the same Defence Force as Australia or the United States and so on. There's a recognition of size. What do our allies expect and maybe demand that we can do?
We've had long-standing defence partnerships with a number of countries, obviously US, UK, Australia are foremost amongst them, but even in the broader Indo-Pacific, we've had the five-power defence arrangement for 50-odd years with Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, and us. So we've had an engagement here. I think they expect us to be available, not just for the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, but actually in the event that there is conflict, to at least be able to position ourselves to assist. If we think about the potential conflict in the South China Sea, we have a huge stake in that. It's where the bulk of our exports go to and our imports come from. Our fuel supply comes through there. So it's critically important to us. If something was to happen there, if there were to be an outbreak of conflict, the expectation is that we would be able to support an effort to maintain the security of shipping lanes and shipping routes. I think the challenge for us is, because of the changing landscape and with all due respect to the US, the uncertainty and variability of their level of support in a partnership. I think our expectation of ourselves is that we will have to do more. I think Australia clearly expects us to do more. And I think given what's happening across the South Pacific generally and China's engagement through the Pacific, which is both positive but also carries with it security risks for us, we have to be equipped to deal with that. If you think about China's mission for itself, it wants resources to sustain its industry. It needs to feed itself, and because it's such a significant economic and geopolitical power, it wants to project itself through presence, through diplomatic relationships, but also through military presence as well. That's what it's seeking to achieve. And some of that poses a risk to us, and we have to be positioned to defend ourselves and to work with others to defend ourselves and them in that environment. And that's the challenge we've got. That's the challenge for the Defence Capability Plan when it comes out.
And picking up that last one, sorry, Ruben, I'll come back in 1 second, that I've always had or absorbed the view that there's no ways we could defend ourselves. It's that extremely long coastline with a small population, and we wouldn't have enough guns. Therefore, we must maintain relationships so that if we ever were in the situation you've just highlighted, Ruben, others would come to our aid. Are we confident people would come to are people going to come running if we cry wolf?
Yeah, it's not just relationships so that people might come in running to help us. It's also relationships so we get access to defence technology, modern defence technology, which can be remotely operated. If you think about where the future is much more remotely controlled equipment, but also satellite technology, our ability to keep our economic zone under surveillance, not just our economic zone, but actually, we cooperate with other Pacific states on their economic zones as well, which is why our relationships with our long-standing partners and others, where possible, might be with South Korea, might be with European partners. I had an amazing meeting for a day in Turkey with a presentation from their Minister of Defence and military leadership on their defence industry, which was way more comprehensive and sophisticated than I had thought. But basically pitching to say, look, if you want it, we might have it, consider us. But we need to be forging those partnerships if we want access to technology that means we can do more stuff for ourselves, but also be available to help others where needed as well.
Right, and I think we're going to pick up on AUKUS in 1 minute, but sorry, Ruben.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add, it's interesting if you look at the terminology, the joint terminology of us in Australia, where we talk about not just interoperability, but increasingly interchangeability. So that's the idea that our service people, our platforms could substitute in and out with the Australian military, right? That's a pretty deep level of integration we are intending to head towards. Are we heading there? I don't know. Are we funding that? I don't know. Is AUKUS Pillar 2 a piece of that? Potentially. We also talk about joint deterrence. So can New Zealand contribute to joint deterrence alongside the Australians right now? Again, I think it's a bit of an open question. The P8s probably play a role there, but
P8s?
Our P8 Poseidon aircraft, they are like militarised 737s that have incredible sensors. They can scout and track submarines. I wonder whose submarines we're concerned about. And they can even have torpedoes on them and so on to attack subsea targets if they have to.
So can I then, let's leap into that. So AUKUS, AUKUS in a nutshell from a non-practitioner. You got Pillar 1, Australia gets nuclear-powered attack submarines, and US and UK base on a rotational basis some of their own nuclear-powered attack submarines in Australia. We weren't invited to be a part of it. We're frankly probably too small to afford a nuclear-powered submarine if we wanted one. We're not sure. That was one take we heard expressed yesterday. Pillar 2 is more about developing tech capabilities in a few areas, undersea capabilities, quantum tech, AI and autonomy, hypersonic capabilities, electronic warfare. So Pillar 1, submarines. Pillar 2, collaboration on tech. I'll start with the former Minister of Defence, but I'm interested in all of your views. If we were invited to be part of Pillar 2, is that something you think we should go into? And other context for those that weren't following, there was an unusual, surprising pairing of Helen Clark and Don Brash, who put out very strong views about what joining AUKUS Pillar 2 might mean, given its intent is pretty explicitly to contain China. So, Andrew, what's your take?
Yeah, firstly, I think we should acknowledge that even with AUKUS Pillar 1, which we could never have been party to because it involved nuclear-powered submarines, it still isn't a done deal yet because it still requires Congress, US Congress, to approve the technology transfer. It didn't happen under Biden's time. I think it's still an open question about whether it will happen under the second Trump presidency. Secondly, even putting aside AUKUS Pillar 1 and just focusing on AUKUS Pillar 2, which is the technology arrangements, my view is that whether it's AUKUS or not I think AUKUS is irrelevant. I think what's most important is that we have good defence partnerships that allow us access to technology that we need for a modern defence force. We've always needed that. Our defence supplies have always come from other countries. To the extent that AUKUS provides an opportunity to assist with development, and it's not even clear what AUKUS Pillar 2 arrangements might entail, are we required to front up with some upfront investment? Is it a commitment to be a consumer? Is it contributing intellectual input? None of that's been sorted out, which is why I think actually the whole AUKUS label is irrelevant. What's most important is that we strengthen our defence partnerships and relationships to get access to that technology. To answer the point that I think Helen Clark and Don Brash have raised, and it is some of the discourse we've got, is that okay, it's a US mission to contain China. And of course, what goes unstated is, well, why would that ever be the case? My view about China is it's, critically, it is, we're now in a multipolar world. China is absolutely critical. We need China to continue developing and enjoy the benefits of its science and technology and engineering, because it will have solutions for the world. But the reality is China operates at multiple levels in its engagement with the rest of the world. And it's its public face, which is always, very positive, but it has a far less transparent face, which is somewhat manipulative and which is exploitative, and that poses security risks. So I don't have a view about a relationship with China being one thing or the other. Yes, we should continue to strengthen our trade relationships, understanding that that poses a potential risk to us if China decides to turn off the tap, as it did with Australia's wine industry. But we should be alert to the risk that it poses and not be naive about that. So I think when we think about those relationships, as I say, increasingly AUKUS becomes irrelevant. It's the nature and quality of defence relationships and what we get out of it to assist us with our defence and national security needs for the reasons that we determine, which is, as I say, because there are some players in the world who are way bigger and better resourced than us, who may not always have positive intent.
Thank you. So, Murray, I'm interested if you a similar view or different?
I think my views are pretty similar to Andrew's. I think kicking the can down the road is the current strategy with regard to AUKUS 2, and sensibly so, because, as Andrew says, we don't know what it is. You could ask the question, what would you get in AUKUS Pillar 2 that you don't get from Five Eyes? I don't know. I think those are questions that will no doubt be discussed by officials, and we'll get some interesting reporting to ministers. But in the meantime, it is in its purest terms a discussion about positioning and labelling and branding. That's what's really on the table here, and that's often the case in foreign policy, particularly, that you hear about fancy labels that are stuck to relationships and strategic partnerships and so on. This is just another one of those labels, a brand that has significance to the players and needs to be teased through somewhat. So with Andrew, I think that what's important is how you build up your capabilities to look after your own interests. Obviously, for reasons of geography and other reasons, it makes sense for us to do that with Australia, and I think maximising interoperability is the way to go. But maximising interoperability with Australia does not mean subcontracting your foreign policy decisions to Australia. Australia has quite a different view, and I think you would have heard this from Scott Morrison. The default setting for Australia, and it's from politicians on both sides, is of the political island Australia. They see themselves as a middle power or a G20 power, pick one of those two, and they behave accordingly. And often, to prove the point, they feel they have to prod the big guys, because if you're scrapping with the big guys, then by definition, you're probably in almost the big guys category, right? It's been a feature over time. New Zealand, I think, because of our size and because of our sort of different settings, has got to be more nuanced in the way it behaves. That doesn't mean that you don't express your views clearly and strongly to, for example, China, when there's a difference about what's happening in the China Sea. But I've never seen taking a long handle to China in the public arena as a very successful strategy. If you want to get them to listen to your concerns about the South China Seas, a small room with no officials present is going to be the way you get them to listen. And that's why when you're having discussions with the Chinese, having a formal meeting, you might say, well, and with other countries as well, can I have a one-on-one with the minister before or after? And I think that's very much the New Zealand way, because we tend to ask ourselves, if I belt these guys in public for something that we're concerned about, am I part of the problem or part of the solution? Often being part of the solution involves something more nuanced than just giving someone a burst in a public place. So I think we need to be careful to distinguish between the Australian style of diplomacy and our own style, and their size and our size, but cooperate with them as far as we can in terms of equipping ourselves to deal with threats.
Can I then, I'll pick up on some of that, and we may come back to the relationships point because I think it ties into some of our earlier discussion on the Pacific. Ruben, going to you and picking up an audience question. In a world order that's moving away from rules-based consensus, what are the emerging drivers of international legitimacy? And I'll ask that in a different way as well, and you choose the path. In a more turbulent, risky world, are we going away from multilateralism into interests? Now, interests are always there, but is that pendulum going to swing a bit to where might is right, and frankly, we just got to look after ourselves? What's your take on that?
I mean, to some degree, yes, we seem to be swinging somewhat away from grand multilateralism towards bilateralism, transactionalism, and so on. It doesn't mean it will always be the case, though. I mean, there are major emerging global issues. Climate change is an obvious one that countries do need to cooperate on. Artificial intelligence. At some point, there's going to be some calamity because of AI's emerging features, and hopefully that will lead to some global response so we can try and regulate this alien that's being unleashed. Transactionalism is where we seem to be headed, but it doesn't mean every country is going to be transactional. I mean, I still think we are going to be closely aligned with many countries when it comes to values and norms and kind of global self-interests, if you will. And transactionalism, if everyone can kind of agree they have core interests that shouldn't be violated, perhaps it can lead to a certain equilibrium in time between the great powers, getting a bit abstract and maybe academic here. But, you know, we have had 2 wars break out in the last few years. One sometimes wonder if perhaps cutting deals might not be the worst thing right now, at least to stabilise things for a period of time. How New Zealand plugs into that, I mean, clearly we don't want to be in transactional relationships all the time because we're the smaller power and bigger powers can use their leverage against us and others. What we do about this is value proposition, try to be a fair broker, try to be honest, talk behind the scenes, show nuance. But we may have to cut some deals ourselves.
So,
sorry?
do you think there'll be war in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific in the next 10 to 15 years? A war that we will have troops or boats on the ground?
I think no one wants war. I mean, if there's a great power war in our region, it's going to lead to an economic depression for everyone. So there are really strong incentives to not tumble into conflict. We got through the Cold War without a great power war. Hopefully countries learn lessons from the past. I think there's going to be tensions. I think there'll be crises. I think we'll see strategic games play out. In fact, if the Americans look like they're trying to lower the temperature in the Middle East, although, you know, Trump's rhetoric here isn't necessarily lowering the temperature, at least in terms of rhetoric. But certainly it looks like the Trump administration are heading to try and end the Russia-Ukraine war. To me, it's because they want to fixate on the priority theatre, which is the Indo-Pacific. If I'm China, if I'm other players, I know that, and perhaps I have an incentive to try and disrupt the switch, the pivot to Asia, which Obama started, but it's been playing out for over a decade now, and it's going to continue under Trump, because it continued under Biden and into Trump now. I think it will continue. I think we will see games played. I think we will see strategic crises. We will have brinkmanship. I'm hoping we don't cascade into war. I don't know what probability to put on it. 50-50? Doesn't sound great, but I'll put 50-50 on it, that there will be a conflict that involves us in the next 10 to 15 years.
It's remarkable to even say, isn't it? Any other views? Otherwise I'll take us another direction.
I think my answer is only if we get sloppy. You know, it's the usual story about miscalculations and misunderstandings, and that's why I think we need to contribute to ensuring that there isn't scope for those misunderstandings and miscalculations, and it's something that as a smaller country we can contribute to.
Yeah, yeah. Andrew?
Yeah, I think the critical thing is that we take the risk seriously and we equip ourselves accordingly, and we make sure that we are maintaining the strength of our various relationships and partnerships, and others besides, UK, Australia, US, are long-standing strong partners at the moment. But there are others as well, and we know in the Indo-Pacific, and Scott Morrison last night talked about Quad and what have you. I mean, we should be strengthening relationships with the South Koreas, the Philippines, the Indias, who play an interesting role, and all of that. But India has its own ambitions and so on as well as an international player. As it strengthens its economy, it starts it's sending a lot of people around the world. But these are all relationships that we should be spending a lot of time on. I agree with Murray entirely about where our kind of future economic fortunes lie. We've got Indonesia sitting on, not quite on our back doorstep, certainly on Australia's back doorstep, population of 300 odd million people. That ought to be an area where we are spending a lot of time and effort. Strengthening those relationships alongside what we do in defence is the stuff that's going to help to protect us.
Mm. Can I ask a question to Andrew and to Murray? Now, you've sat, and this point I won't ask you to reveal any confidential briefings from years gone by. You've sat in all of those briefings, though, and you've had to work with officials, you worked with allies, you worked with partners. What do you wish that the wider New Zealand voting public understood about our situation? You think, gosh, if the New Zealand politics is domestic, so it's sometimes challenging to make the scale of the things that Ruben's talking about relevant to the average voter, if such a thing exists. What do you wish the New Zealand public might understand about the complexity of this? I'll start with you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think the main thing is the long-held assumption that because we are 3 hours flight from the nearest major landmass, or even some islands and Fiji and stuff, is no longer a protection for us. Actually, things can happen to us and in our neighbourhood that affects our interests. And likewise, something that happens in the South China Sea can have a huge impact on us economically and socially and so on as well. So I think it's about facing the world with our eyes wide open, getting the best information we can. I think perhaps just say one of my biggest disappointments in my time as a minister is one of the things that I think we are crucially lacking, and it was highlighted in the Royal Commission report on the mosque attacks, is a lack of strategic leadership in our national security sort of sector. And there's absolutely no reflection on any of the leaders of our organisations there. They do a brilliant job. But we don't have the horizon scanning strategic leadership that we should have. We started a reform process, and hearing what some people say about the public service, when they really don't want something to happen, is very well practiced at delay and deferral and all the tactics to make sure it doesn't happen. Lo and behold, it didn't happen. But I think that is a gap we have, and we need to address that.
Mm. Murray?
Well, I think I've lamented previously the fact that New Zealand, as a country that depends on its ability to sell stuff around the world to earn a living, is unbelievably introverted and inward-looking as a country. We are very introverted people, and our media reflects this, or perhaps helps create this. So we are uninterested to an alarming degree in what's happening around us in Southeast Asia, where these countries really matter to us, in the Pacific, where we have responsibilities as well as opportunities. And I'd like to see us be more aware and particularly more clear-eyed about what those risks and opportunities are. In the Pacific in particular, we sort of a bit blasé about this, but just to give you one example, between New Zealand and Australia, we were spending $300 million a year with Ramsey, nearabouts anyway, about $300 million a year to stop 600,000 people from killing each other. Now, right next door, you've got Papua New Guinea with a population of, 16, 17 million? No one's got an accurate number. And if things get rough there, you can imagine how much difficulty and strife that's going to cause. So I'd like to think that we could see a greater level of interest in where the trade opportunities and diplomatic opportunities might be on one hand, and where the responsibilities might be on the other side. As a country, we need to be more interested in the world we live in, and particularly the region we live in.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we're going to wrap, and I'm going to give you each a brief moment. The theme of the last couple of days has been unconstrained thinking, but also constrained times. Economics is about constraints. So just going down the line, how would you prioritise? What are the highest priorities you would want to put into our, I'll call it our foreign affairs and defence space? I'll start with you, Ruben, as we wrap up.
I think rejuvenating the Defence Force, thinking about our resiliency in case we are cut off or when there are future global shocks, because there are going to be more that it could interfere with our connectivity to the world. And the South Pacific too, raising awareness, getting more journalists out there, delivering, spending more. Those are the 3 areas I'd say. Thank you.
Murray?
One thing, in the region, in the Pacific, we've got to be the guys who deliver stuff. There are lots of people out there who talk. They particularly talk about with large numbers, announcing large programs, particularly in the climate area and so on. Actually, we should distinguish ourselves as the people who pick up difficult things and deliver outcomes. That should be our point of difference.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, look, we're only going to get noticed when we are present, and so we need a presence with our partners around the world, and we need a presence in the Pacific, and as Murray would say, it's a presence that has to count. It has to make a difference. That was what will set us apart. I mean, what the strength we have that others don't have is the Pacific Island diaspora in New Zealand. That's a huge benefit to us and a springboard to us, and we should be, making good use of that as the basis of our relationship with our South Pacific partners.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, a fascinating discussion. Can I please ask you to put your hands together for our panellists? Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah.
Thank you. Cheers. All right, we're coming to the end of the forum and a day and a half, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's feeling a little bit overloaded on content and needing to navigate some new things. It'll be a heavy thinking weekend. So I'd like to say a couple of things to wrap us up before we let you get off on your Friday afternoon and enjoy a wonderful weekend. So the first is to say thanks, and my first thank you is to you as an audience. This is the largest economics forum we've had so far. It's our 5th. It seems, chatting to people, that the range of topics and the breadth of discussion is proving useful. But first, thank you for being here. A second thanks to our speakers. The value of an event like this really comes from having experts who are both knowledgeable but also willing to open up and share their expertise with us. Thank you to the University of Waikato, particularly Vice-Chancellor Professor Neil Quigley and our Chancellor Sir Anand Satyanand, who have both been here through the forum for hosting us in the PAR. It's an exceptional venue for a space like this. Thank you to RCP, who sponsored last night's discussion with Scott Morrison that allowed us to get him across from Australia, which is brilliant. Thank you to our facilitators, to Josie Pagani from last night, but also Professor Anna Strutt and Stephen Joyce. Stephen has been instrumental in bringing the forum together and conceived of the idea initially back in 2020. And lastly, those are all people that you've seen, or that you are, those on the scenes, but there are some people behind the scenes, whether it be Paula there, who's been running the show, or the team at the back, or those that have been preparing fantastic food for us, managing all the technology. Can you just put your hands together for those that managed that? All right, so let's try to make sense of some of this. We've had a lot over the last day and a half, and the sessions are actually already online. If you go to the website, just look up Economics Forum 2025, and you can find any session if you really want to max out your weekend's enjoyment. So just to rewind a little bit, we started yesterday morning at this podium with Finance Minister Nicola Willis, the third year in a row she's been here. She talked a little bit about the constraints, but also announced the launch of a 5-point plan around economic growth, the going for growth side. We went then into artificial intelligence, possibly the, I chatted to Damon after that session, and he made the point, is it overhyped or no, underhyped? You know, where it's hard for us to get our heads around all of that it's going to do. We met and heard from Sir Brian Roach, the new head of the public service, and what he's looking to do there. He's got an enormous amount on his plate. We have had sessions on local government in here, enormous challenges in there, and on genetic technologies, where very fast-moving space, both from the science and the regulatory framework. University, the fundamentals of how we build a talented workforce, and then finished yesterday with American politics, which was absolutely fascinating. Last night, for those that were in the room, ScoMo Scott Morrison gave very frank and candid insights, that one's not on the website, into his time as leader, his personal faith, but also in being in the room, negotiating things like AUKUS, his take on the relationships with someone like Donald Trump. Fascinating. This morning, hearing from Ian Rennie running the Treasury, Pharmac and Medicines, in the other room, Kiwi Schools, Economics and the Environment. We've heard about the energy sector in transition, and we're finishing on geopolitics and defence. There is an enormous amount of content there, and an enormous amount of complexity. And so I was, your job when you're doing this kind of thing is thinking of a theme. So I haven't thought of a theme, but I've recalled a whakatauki, hei aha te kai a te rangatira. There are a lot of leaders in this room. So what is the food of leaders? He kōrero, he kōrero, he kōrero. It is communication, it is dialogue, it is knowledge. So an event like this is intended to provide you with access to expertise, knowledge, opinions, so that you can go and use those in leading your own organisations or roles. I'll finish with one last thing. We're living obviously in a complex world, but several of our speakers, and Ian Rennie said it very directly this morning, made the point that in the face of complexity, paralysis is an option, but inaction is a choice. So if we choose, if we don't act, that is always also a choice, but inaction makes the trade-offs much harder later. And so hopefully we've given you some access to different points of view over the last couple of days, but also primed you to go out and make whatever decisions you need to for your organisations. Lastly, as I mentioned, this is the 5th round of the New Zealand Economics Forum. If you've enjoyed it, we'll see you back here. The dates are already in the calendar, so February 12th and 13th next year. We will be here for the 2026 New Zealand Economics Forum. And in the meantime, I wish you all well. Thank you again, and look forward to seeing you next year. Kia ora.